humanists are discriminated against in 186 countries, which, to save you the maths, is almost every country in the world.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in Washington, D.C. The 2023 Freedom of Thought Report from Humanist International is a global survey that assesses every country in the world on the basis of human rights and legal status with regard to humanists, atheists, and the non-religious. I'll talk with Humanist International's Gary McLelland and Nicole Carr of the American Humanist Association.
First of all, not surprisingly, the Israel-Hamas war and its fallout, and includes the grief on all sides, the protests on many sides, and the huge political tensions.
Seems like every year religious themes are key to understanding more and more of the events defining the world we live in. Understanding those themes is getting more difficult and more important, and that's why I am happy to have veteran Religion News Service journalists Adelle Banks and Jack Jenkins back with us for another year-end review of the top stories in religion news from the past 12 months. We are growing the State of Belief, building on our 17-year history by partnering with Religion News Service. And as part of the RNS family of podcasts, there's a next generation, the State of Belief podcast, I want to make sure you are subscribed to. Please visit stateofbelief.com/new podcast. It would really help to have you subscribe and to tell people you're close to about the conversations you are hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can help keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us in that work at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my first guest. Gary McLelland is Chief Executive at Humanist International, the global representative body at the heart of the humanist movement, championing human rights, secularism, democracy, and rule of law. The American Humanist Association advocates progressive values and equality for humanists, atheists, and free thinkers. Nicole Carr, Interim Executive Director at the AHA, where she also serves as editor for Humanist Magazine and thehumanist.com. Today we'll be talking about the 2023 Freedom of Thought Report, which is a truly global effort, and the findings deserve a lot of attention from anyone who values freedom of belief for all. Nicole, Gary, welcome to the State of Belief.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, let's start with some really basics for our listeners in case they're not familiar with the term humanism and humanist. What does that mean, and what is some of the history of this movement as it has arrived at 2023?
Well, the official definition of humanism that we formally use on our site is that humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without theism or other supernatural beliefs, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. There are many definitions of humanism. I mean, basically, it's the belief in science and reason, and that humans are capable of leading significant, meaningful, and ethical lives without recourse to a supreme being.
It's so important
religion.
That we talk about humanism when we talk about freedom of belief and diverse beliefs, because humanism is a part of that circle. People have every right to espouse humanism and live lives with humanism and humanist principles, and be respected by the law exactly as the same as anyone else. And that is just a really important part of what I believe America is called to. It may not live up to it as much, but that is very much what I believe also Interfaith Alliance is called to as we do our work. And so we're very pleased and proud to be colleagues and allies with the Humanist Association. Gary, does that definition change as you look at it globally, or is it largely similar defining principles?
I think one interesting thing to say is that when we look back at any group of humans, any human civilization throughout history for which we can have evidence. We see evidence that there was groupings of people who wanted to live good, ethical lives based on a naturalistic philosophy, or of interpreting science, reason, art, literature, etc. And the modern word that we use for those people, at least in English, is humanists or humanism. But we can see that back throughout the course of history in ancient India, all across the world, there have been groups of people which we would now call humanists, but in the past may have used different labels. And in fact, across the world now, you'll see that there is a range of different labels used. Some people prefer to call themselves atheists, rationalists, freethinkers. And I think for us, we try to use the broad overarching umbrella of humanist, but we understand that within that sort of culture, there is a broad spectrum of identities. And Humanist International actually was founded by the American Humanist Association and 4 other organizations back in 1952 to really try to bring together and act as a sort of democratic forum for this spectrum of organizations, which, as I said, have this naturalistic, progressive philosophy based on reason and science, art, literature, etc.
I notice you have an accent. Are you from Mississippi or?
Slightly further away than that. I'm actually from Glasgow in Scotland.
And if you're a humanist, how do you organize? I mean, I think one of the interesting stories about humanism, or there have been moments where certain people are kind of creating not churches, but quasi-churches or things that bring people together to reflect on like the very principles that you're talking about. And they don't have prayers to God, but they may have other things that are rituals. Or I'm just curious, what are ways that humanists in this moment organize in America, Nicole, but then also curious about other locations where you've seen interesting ways that people have come together not only for community support, but also for mobilization of principles that can impact government and local officials?
So in the United States, for the American Humanist Association, we have a network of 240 local groups across the country. And those groups all sort of organize themselves slightly differently, but basically they have at least monthly meetings. Some of our very active groups have several meetings a month, and they come together to do different things, community projects, listen to speakers, they have book clubs. And so we help support them and organize through them. We also have individual members. For some humanists are not big on joining organized groups, so we also have plenty of individual members. There are also, when you talk about religious congregations, there are, and sometimes they get called religious humanists. We do have people in our community, especially who are also affiliated with the American Ethical Union and the Unitarian Universalist Church, more sort of organized church-like congregations.
Yeah. Yeah. Gary, how are people organized around the world? And then I want to get to, will be a good segue into learning more from the report, the important report that you all launched this week.
Yeah, there's a whole range of different activities that humanists coalesce around in different parts of the world. So we see, ranging in things from, cultural and art exhibitions. So in the Netherlands, for example, they're very often having art exhibitions based on humanist values and cultural events and so on. The environmental issues that we're facing as a global society, motivates a lot of humanists to take action and get involved in community change and so on. Humanist organisations also provide a range of social services. So here in the US, the AHA and its adjunct organisations provide a whole range of ceremonial support for people going through the various stages of life. In fact, the country which I come from, Scotland, we have a long tradition, well, I say long tradition, let's say a 20-year-old tradition of humanist weddings, and it's actually the most popular form of belief wedding in Scotland. So humanists in Scotland conduct more weddings than the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland. So there's a whole range of different things that humanist organisations and humanist communities do to try and meet the needs of their members. One interesting way, actually, which perhaps dovetails into the findings of the report is we see almost like an evolution of the type of services and support that humanist organisations will provide based on the level of persecution and or acceptance of humanist communities. So For example, there does exist humanist communities in Pakistan, to some extent, in Afghanistan, in places where you would think, and you would be correct, that those communities would be heavily persecuted and in fact outlawed in many cases. And so the activities that a humanist organisation will be involved in there will be, first of all, very secretive, underground. They may involve simply the act of meeting is a very sort of defiant and brave thing for them to do, to simply exist and to label themselves. But then as you kind of move along into more of an accepting situation, so let's think here perhaps of a country like Guatemala, where there's perhaps not outright persecution and violence, but where to be a humanist and to embody those values is extremely socially stigmatized. The activities that you might be involved in there might be fighting for acceptance, so fighting for the right to register your non-profit, to exist, to operate as an organisation. But then you might move on further through the continuum to think of a country like Norway, perhaps one of the most humanist countries in the world, where the Norwegian Humanist Association has over 100,000 members for a country of about 5 million people. And from that point of view, the activities might be focused on more ceremonial support. They provide, for example, chaplains to all the different institutions of the state, and they provide education services in schools. And in actual fact, Norway has a very long tradition of what are called humanist confirmations. So this is a sort of coming of age ceremony for young adults around the age of 13 or so, where all of their families and friends gather together to mark that kind of passing into, the sort of early stages of adulthood. And that's an extremely popular thing, which, I don't know the figure offhand, but a very high percentage of young people in Norway will go through that humanist confirmation ceremony. So the range, I think, does depend a lot on the extent to which humanists can be and exist in a society.
The staff of the Humanist Society would be very unhappy with me if I didn't mention that we also do endorse celebrants who do marriages, funerals, naming ceremonies, and things like that. We have a network of over 400 endorsed celebrants, and we also provide training for chaplains. It's increasingly becoming popular to have humanist chaplains at universities, and
right. Yeah. No, I was also a chaplain in a university, and so long-term colleagues at Yale and Harvard.
Yes.
And so it's wonderful that that this is happening. I could talk about this forever, but I do want to get to the report. Please talk to me a little bit about what are some top-line takeaways in 2023 that this report has revealed? And as you get into those, how long have you been doing this report? And are there trends that you've seen?
That's a great question. So this year's report is the 12th edition of the Freedom of Thought report. It actually started as a collaboration with the American Humanist Association, Humanist International, and the US government actually provided initial funding to look into these, discrimination against atheists, humanists, and the non-religious. So yeah, it's in the 12th edition, so we've really been tweaking and improving the report as we go along. You can view the full report on our website, which is fot.humanists.international, and we make available all of the data that actually powers the ratings in the report. So we have a very clear open data policy where people can look at the data that we've gathered, analyse it, critique it, etc. So yeah. Some of the headline takeaways make for, I think, pretty grim reading. So we, through our data, analysed that humanists are discriminated against in 186 countries, which, to save you the maths, is almost every country in the world, depending on how you count, of course. We know that government figures and state agencies openly harass, incite or intimidate the non-religious in 11 countries. It's actually illegal or just simply technically impossible to identify as an atheist or as a non-religious person in 15 countries. In 23 countries, non-religious people are barred from holding a state office. And we know that blasphemy laws remain in force in 87 countries across the world. And of course, blasphemy laws affect humanists and atheists, but they also affect all religion and belief minorities. So whenever you're not in the majority, blasphemy laws are something which will inevitably be used to silence, intimidate, or persecute you. We also know that in 33 countries, there is mandated state religious instruction, without a non-religious alternative available. So these are some of the kind of headline figures, and what we try to do in the report is to shine a light on some of the individual countries that we want to draw attention to and supplement that with some testimonials and some more sort of detailed human stories to back up these statistics.
What is the trajectory? Like, does this feel like things are going in a positive direction for humanists, or does it feel like there's a regression right now, or is it mixed?
It's certainly a mixed picture. However, I think we can definitely see that generally the trend is not good. It's a negative trending direction. I think we know that all minority groups in these times of rising populism, of economic uncertainty, etc., all minority groups are subject to ostracization, to the othering, and used as scapegoats for populist rhetoric by government officials in many countries. So humanists are no different from many other religion and belief minorities and minorities generally. So we know that is part of the global trend. I think Humanist International's position has always been that we advocate for a genuinely open, inclusive form of freedom of religion or belief. So, we want to work alongside religious organisations and other NGOs to push forward for universal human rights for all. I mean, our vision is that freedom of religion or belief is a mainstreamed human right. I think all too often, especially if I can say from some of the US government rhetoric at times, religious freedom, as it's often, I think, unhelpfully shorthanded to, is used as a way of sort of promoting religious exceptionalism. The idea that religious rights can trump, for example, the rights of women, of LGBT folks, etc. I think what we're trying to advocate for is that if we can push forward the human rights of all, including religion and belief minorities and others, that really will benefit everybody. Of course, there inevitably comes a time when you have to balance these rights, but I think that has to be done, gently, thoughtfully, openly, and I think that's really the message that we try to get across with this report.
Yeah, you really stated it well. We are an organization that uses terms like inclusive religious freedom or a combination. We use religious freedom as a complement to civil rights. Religious freedom is not meant to allow you to discriminate against anyone. We like to say, religion should be a cause of celebration, not discrimination. And if it's used as a discrimination policy, then you're probably doing something wrong. Nicole, tell us a little bit about how this report, looking around the world, lands with you with a special lens towards the United States and some of what you're seeing here, and if any of the information or statistics that came up about the United States were surprising to you or confirmed things that you were already seeing?
This year, the United States isn't one of the 40 updated countries. But what I always find interesting with the report is that, the United States, despite the issues we're having with Christian nationalists, especially the ones that are in our government and on the benches of our courts, still has a rating of free and equal in the report. And I think it just highlights that we have to remember how bad the situation can be in other countries, and that to a large extent, even given how much we have to work to protect the civil rights we have regarding religion and separating church and state, we still have a lot of privilege in the United States when it comes to that. We are still allowed to run for office. We can still take it to court when particular religions are taught as fact in our schools.
You putting those two side by side is really important, because there are people who are very determined to downgrade our rating. And so how do we show up alongside one another? I'm a Christian, and I have a lot of privilege as a Christian, but often Christian nationalists are saying exactly the opposite thing. We need to make common cause with so many other people who say no one gets to decide what is the way that we're going to be stating belief or establishing a religion, which is totally against the idea that America was founded on. And yet people are promoting that idea. And so it's really important that humanists and Christians and other religious people recognize one another as allies so that we can all be free to live our lives. One of the groups that we've had a really interesting time and have been honored to kind of be part of a conversation with is the Free Thought Caucus on the Hill. And what's interesting about that, and I just want to remind people, there are religious people on the Free Thought Caucus. It is not like an exclusive group only for humanists who pass the litmus test of what is a humanist. It's actually for anyone who wants to promote freedom of thought, freedom of ability to be as you are. It's in Congress. There are members like Representative Raskin, Representative Huffman, others, including Jews, Muslims, Christians, and humanists. And I just think it's really an example of what the kind of society we want to build.
It's important to remember that the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, which is up to 20 members now, we just had some new announcements of people in the last couple of years. One of the new members of Congress, Representative Frost, just joined, and he is religious. In fact, all the members of the caucus are religious, except for Representative Huffman. Jared Huffman is the only person in Congress who has declared that they're a humanist. Representative Raskin, who is the co-founder with Representative Huffman of the caucus and the co-chair, is, as you said, Jewish.
You know, we had Representative Raskin on the show to talk a little bit about that and other wonderful things. And so I also just, you know, as both of you are very much noting, it's interesting thinking about the younger generation. And, you know, many of them do not adhere to a religious group per se, but they, I think, are very aligned with what might be called humanist. I also remember a friend of mine, I'm not going to out him because, you know, we haven't talked about it, but, you know, he was really interested in something called Christian humanism, which involves like this idea of like, you know, a lot of framework and language, and yet not inviting kind of a supernatural imposition on it. And so like a moral code that comes out of Jesus' teaching. It's just it was interesting to see how people are taking these important ideas, which are, you could almost say, foundational to the founding of the country. Many people would say it was Christianity that did it, but also it was the Enlightenment and this idea that we can, you know, we can agree across ideas, but with this idea towards improving our world, allowing people to live in peace, allowing people to be free. I think it's just really important. What would you say is the best way for those listeners who are interested in learning more? You mentioned a website. I'd love to highlight that one more time.
Sure. The AHA's website is americanhumanist.org, and Humanist International's website is humanists.international.
Beautiful. Now, I like to end my show by talking about hope. And I don't know, like, I assume hope is allowed in humanist ideas.
Hope is encouraged, yes.
What gives each of you, if you could offer just what gives you hope right now in a time where many things feel locked and many people are grappling with, you know, frankly, a real despair. What gives you hope and how can you share that with our listeners?
One of the things that gives me a lot of hope is the spectrum of people and groups who are, you know, sort of joining arms to try to protect the country against Christian nationalism. And as you said before, it's as much people of faith who are doing it as humanists and atheists, because it behooves us all to make sure that our government isn't run by a single religion and that the beliefs of a single group of people. But the movement to protect against that wave is what gives me hope.
I think what I would say, Paul, is that you know, by the time this interview is aired, we will have launched the Freedom of Thought report in Congress with a whole range of guests, including you know, US representatives from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, from the American Humanist Association and others. And I think the fact that we are able to, and indeed invited to come and make the case for this important freedom of religion or belief at the literal capital of the most powerful country in the world, and we're able to make those arguments, for me, is a real case for optimism. I'm not sure if it would have been possible to do it, you know, 5 or 10 years ago, but it is possible now. And I think further to that, the conversation that we've had with you today, Paul, I think is evidence of conversations which are happening all over the world with people who come to the same issue with different perspectives, different philosophies. And although we could, if we wanted, I don't particularly want to, but we could, if we wanted, focus on what we disagree about. We've actually chosen to focus today on where we agree and where we can work together, where we can put aside our differences, make common cause for a better US, a better country, a better world. And I think that the arguments that we're going to make this week when we launch this report, I think are pretty sound arguments that most reasonable people would agree with. And I think that if we can make that case and we can bring people on side with us, I think that's a real positive case for optimism.
Gary McLelland is Chief Executive at Humanist International, the global representative body at the heart of the humanist movement. Nicole Carr is Interim Executive Director at the AHA, where she serves as the editor for the Humanist magazine and thehumanist.com. Thank you both so much for joining me today on The State of Belief. And I want to mention the 2023 Freedom of Thought Report, which is out now, and everyone should take a look to learn more about humanism and the state of humanist thought around the world.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been wonderful to be on the show.
Up next, a review of the top religion news stories of 2023. I'll be joined by Religion News Service's Adelle Banks and Jack Jenkins. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. And make sure you subscribe to the Next Generation podcast at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. That's stateofbelief.com/new podcast. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Caitlin Beatty.
Saved by the City is a podcast from two Christian women cracking the code of faith from the mean streets of New York City.
Our podcast captures what happens when purity culture meets hookup culture, when distraction steals from devotion, and when the diversity of viewpoints and lifestyles clash against assumptions.
Gotham can be a weird place for Christian women, but we're out there, and we have stories to tell.
Saved by the City, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
It doesn't seem long ago that we were reviewing 2022 in religion news with my next guest, but here we are 12 months later and many, many important news stories later. So I'm very happy to welcome Adelle Banks, project editor and national reporter at Religion News Service, and Jack Jenkins, author and RNS national reporter, back to The State of Belief. Welcome to both of you. Okay, here's the list time. Adelle, what's on your list for your top stories of 2023?
Thank you for asking. I'm going to just tick off some of the major things that I think RNS and others have been covering. First of all, not surprisingly, the Israel-Hamas war and its fallout are something that we are covering, and includes the grief on all sides, the protests on many sides, and the huge political tensions. Denominational battles are among things on my list, among them the United Methodist Church, where thousands of churches have now disaffiliated. Some of those churches are departing and joining the Global Methodist Church, which is a new denomination formed last year with more conservative sets of beliefs. Then another denominational battle is the Southern Baptist Convention, which affirmed the disaffiliation of churches that chose to have women in pastoral roles, including Rick Warren's founded Saddleback Church. And then, along with other faith groups, the Southern Baptists are dealing with issues related to sexual abuse. And in this year, one of the things that happened was they were denounced because some of their entities were involved in a court filing that may limit their liability with some sex abuse claims. Then next on the list, another denomination is Church of England, which last month, as our Catherine Pepinster wrote for RNS, the Church of England is giving a test run to services about blessing same-sex couples. And lastly, it's kind of grouped together, but it has to do with violence in houses of worship and the results of that violence. There were 3 children and 3 adults who were killed at a Christian school in Nashville. But there also was major court action where there was a conviction in the Tree of Life synagogue killings in Pittsburgh. And then the Justice Department had a sizable settlement with victims of the mass shooting at the First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs in Texas.
Wow, it's a really good list, because those of us who maybe are looking at the big national picture forget how important congregations are in the life of most Americans who are, going to church and doing the thing. And the ripping apart of denominations is traumatic for millions of people, because they're going through it, and they can't kind of say, oh, on Sunday, I'm going to go to a place of respite and relax. It's actually sometimes a place of great conflict. And what you've highlighted is it is not a place where people can go to escape what's happening in the world or to feel, necessarily elevated. Sometimes they're drawn more deeply into it. And so one of the questions, and I know you must have interviewed a lot of people, are there particular people, when you think of especially the denominations and the denominational split, are there individuals or churches that you remember interviewing that really kind of made you go, oh, this is really heartbreaking, or who illuminated something for you?
Well, one thing I was going to mention is that I recently wrote about polarization, and one of the things that struck me is how the clergy have to deal with people divided, not just about the direction of their denomination or their faith group, but just all of these cultural issues. And it's like it's an added job description for these clergy that they have to try to help people through. And it's not just in their sermons, it's in one-on-one conversations. And it's got to be very stressful. And it probably adds to the issues of clergy burnout and as well as exhaustion. So that's part of what struck me, is just hearing clergy talk about how they try to do this to keep going and keep their congregations going.
Well, it's really interesting, because I think back to my seminary days, and that was not a topic that we discussed, like how to keep a congregation together that is deeply riven by issues. I mean, it's difficult for people who only do that kind of moderation or mediation, and for people who are doing that on top of running a church with all of the other financial things. Or synagogue or mosque. I mean, this is not, and there's no religious tradition that has escaped the divisions of the kind of culture wars, but also of sexual abuse scandals and things like that. This is a subjective statement. So, but do you think that there has been progress made around clergy abuse, or do you feel like we're still kind of treading water? If you look at the various stories that you watched, and I know you have watched this so carefully and been such a service to all of your readers, including myself, where are we with clergy abuse?
I think that it is an ongoing issue, and that there were some issues with Me Too, for instance, and then Church Too, that helped bring it to light in a greater way. And there have been major statements and even like litanies where different groups have said, we're sorry, and what can we do better? But there's still a lot happening that still needs to be addressed. And especially the survivors and the advocates for survivors are continuing to beat that drum. And so wouldn't say it's certainly not over. And I think that in the case of Southern Baptist Convention, that's just one example of how things still keep popping up where people are angry and other people are like, well, what can we do? So it's I don't want to say never ending, but it definitely hasn't ended.
Yeah. Watching with some disbelief, and when Rick Warren's church was thrown out of the Southern Baptist Convention because they had a female pastor, it was one of those moments you're like, wow, who would have thought 15 years ago when Rick Warren was at his apex and was quite a conservative voice in many respects, that he would be disfellowshipped into the church that he founded. I mean, it just shows you how many people are caught up in this broader battle around gender, about religion, around all these things that are balled up in some of these statements and some of these actions of the denominations. So
I should point out that Rick Warren is is the founder of Saddleback, but he's not the minister there now. But he was sort of the spokesperson for the church about this debate. And I should also note that the debate isn't completely over, because even though the decision was made about his church and several others that had women who were pastors, there is a second vote coming up for like a constitutional change that kind of codifies this more. And there are some people that are concerned about whether there should be a second vote. And so that still kind of hangs in the balance in some ways for the Southern Baptist Convention. So that's one of the things that we'll be wondering about for next year.
Oh, yeah. Stay tuned. Well, as an American Baptist with, soul freedom and all that, ability to fellowship, it seems like to codify something like that would be, in my humble opinion, not something that would be very Baptist, but there you are. No one's asking my opinion on this one. I'm so surprised to hear. Adelle, thank you so much. And I just want to mention one story that you wrote that we talked about it last time you were on, which just was a marvelous reporting, an example of the value of religion journalism, which is interviewing the women around the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, and just what that maybe didn't make it to the top religion story of the year, but it was such an important way that we can tell stories from people whose stories maybe got missed and before, and so just want to raise that one up for our listeners to go back and look at that if you hadn't had a chance to look at it. Okay,
thank you,
Jack Jenkins. You have your own list, but I'm just gonna just say it. You also have a deadline coming up that is imminent, and we all are celebrating that wonderful thing to come. So Jack, do you want to share with listeners at all about what's coming up for you?
My wife and I are expecting a child any day now. And so, if
this interview gets cut short, people, it's because it just happened.
Exactly.
So you'll know what a great blessing. So
Thank
just
you.
Fantastic. So Jack, what rises to the top of your religion list?
Yeah. So I'll note that I overlap with Adelle in noting that the Israel-Hamas war continues to be a significant religion story, and not only abroad, where obviously a lot of the news is happening, but also here domestically, and at the intersection of religion and politics. It's been a fascinating story to cover, particularly for Democrats and the religious communities that often vote for Democrats, right? We know a lot of coverage has looked at splits within the American Jewish community, where the majority supports the way President Biden has been handling the war, but a vocal minority has persistently argued the opposite. We also saw Congress have a public rift over whether or not anti-Zionism constitutes anti-Semitism, and that was at the center of that rift were prominent Jewish members of Congress, prominent Jewish Democrats who were disagreeing on that issue. We also have seen Muslim Americans be very vocal in criticizing the Biden administration, to the point where there are concerns about for whether or not Biden will have to wrangle with the fallout from his handling of the Israel-Hamas war next year, with constituencies in Michigan where there's a heavy Muslim American population. And outside of that, there's been broader faith-based pushback, a myriad of vigils and protests that religious groups have participated in, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and being critical of the Biden administration's handling of it. Both mainline Christians and also Black Protestants in particular, a group of Black clergy took out a full-page ad in the New York Times recently, signed by 900 Black faith leaders and clergy, calling for a ceasefire and voicing some criticism with the Biden administration. And that happened after a meeting with the White House. And that's not the only meeting that the White House has had with faith communities who have voiced similar dispositions. And whether or not this will cost Biden votes the next go round this following year is anyone's guess, but I feel certain he's going to be facing some questions from faith communities as the campaign heats up going into next November. Meanwhile, also on Capitol Hill, there's continued debate over Christian nationalism following the ascendancy of Speaker Mike Johnson, who, while he has been dismissive of the term Christian nationalism, has espoused various forms of Christian nationalism throughout his career. And there's been a lot of dialogue and reporting about his past rhetoric on those issues. Meanwhile, the Christian nationalism debate continues to be present nationwide, everything from the passage of a bill in the state of Texas that allows for public schools to have chaplains, to broader school board fights in general, where folks espousing forms of Christian nationalism are either yelling at school boards or being elected to school boards. And we're seeing various different groups revving up for this 2024 election in ways that kind of have sparked elements of Christian nationalism in various churches and candidates. And then, of course, there's been the fallout from the overturning of Roe v. Wade that continues nationwide. Everything from referendums in states like Ohio that have consistently benefited abortion rights activists, to lawsuits filed by religious leaders in various states to actually overturn the abortion bans in those states, making a religious argument for against these abortion bans, to former President Trump suddenly taking a more moderate, comparatively stance on abortion compared to his previous rhetoric on the issue. To even Catholic lawmakers, Catholic Democrats in the House of Representatives reissuing a statement of principles in support of abortion rights, in some ways in defiance of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Speaking of Catholicism, my next big story is the removal of Joseph Strickland from his perch as a bishop of Tyler, Texas, by Pope Francis. That's part of a couple of different things Pope Francis has done in kind of pushing back against some of his more strident conservative critics. Bishop Strickland in particular was on the farthest right wing of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. He also, led a prayer at the Jericho March, which is part of the lead up to January 6th. And so, the dialogue around how that happened, why that happened, and, even the most recent Bishops' Conference meeting in Baltimore, the fact that Strickland was just kind of outside the Bishops' Conference, spending time with supporters. There's been a lot of drama and dialogue around that. And then finally, for me, another big religion story that got a lot of coverage when it occurred was the expulsion of lawmakers from the Tennessee legislature, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, over their activism calling for gun control legislation in that state following horrific mass shooting. One of the things that became really clear pretty quickly during that whole debate was that both of those lawmakers appealed to religious rhetoric in making their cases. And also, it turns out that both of those lawmakers actually kind of cut their teeth in progressive religious activism before becoming members of the state legislature. So those are the main big five for me that I thought were particularly interesting and impactful and kind of illuminating various different elements of the religious landscape and how it intersects with the political landscape in the United States.
It's been very interesting to see Speaker Johnson, because at first we thought, he was downplaying the Christian nationalism and downplaying it. And then he went to the Christian Lawmakers Association or something like that. And we were talking about it actually on last week's show. And he said, I'm like Moses, I am as Moses, I didn't know that was going to be my role, but that's my role. And all that, right. He's just, kind of leaning into it. And if you saw the latest GOP fundraising email, which is all about we're going to lose God's favor because of, abortion, because of LGBT. I mean, really some wildly, I would say almost extremist Christian nationalist rhetoric in order to rally the base. So we're, I think, just beginning to go down that road, and you can't really look towards Trump he's kind of the mascot, but he's certainly not the spokesperson for Christian nationalism. The Speaker Johnson really is. It's going to get real in a lot of ways, and the election is certainly going to highlight a lot of that. And I think, what's happening right now in Texas with Katie Cox and abortion is really kind of crystallizing a lot of that debate. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. And it's just so clear that the majority of American people are not in favor of the way this is being exercised. But we shall see how that plays also in the election to come. A lot of things that you mentioned are all related to the election. Mm-hmm. Spending a little time on Israel-Hamas war, this is, I'll just say personally, in the 25, 30 years I've been doing interfaith relations, I've never seen a more difficult time to really a lot of longstanding relationships are being tested. But it is also an opportunity for people, to have real conversations if we can come together. But it's very, very hard. And many people feel almost an existential threat in this current moment. And so, I appreciate the reporting on that. And there are places where I hear people talking to one another and even just showing up for one another and being empathetic with one another, not reaching agreement with one another, but willing to be with one another. There are moments where that is happening. I don't know if either of you have any good stories to share about that, because there's really not a lot of positive news right now. But if you have any stories to share, I'd be interested in hearing them.
Yeah, I just wrote a story recently about polarization and preaching and talked to clergy about how they have worked to try to reduce it if they possibly can. And a rabbi at Washington Hebrew Congregation in D.C. talked about having learned from the One America movement organization that there are ways to try to get people to listen to one another. They even have a script that she used at a workshop in her synagogue to help people try to have, quote, kind of healthy conversations, is what I think they called it. And there were instances in this particular synagogue where you have parents who discover that their college-age kids feel completely differently on this issue than they do, or younger folks, millennial Jews, who are looking at Facebook and seeing that some friends that they were close to also were like completely on a different side than they were. And so anyway, at this workshop, this rabbi mentioned offering the script to people to use with those that they were trying to converse with. And she gave an example of a young woman who used it with a friend they were just really, thought they had just really severe differences. And the woman told the rabbi that she thought she saved her friendship, basically, by using this technique. So that's an example where people are trying and sometimes succeeding in finding ways to continue to be friends in the midst of something where people are so divided.
At Interfaith Alliance, listeners know we have an interfaith community pledge that we've invited people to sign on to, which really says we'll show up for each other, because there's also, simultaneously, as you two certainly know, and our listeners have heard, spiking incidents of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that were already incredibly high, the highest since 2001, and now spiked even further and resulting in real violence. And so the pledge, which for listeners, if you haven't signed on to the pledge, please do, is really about just showing up for people and committing to showing up for people even in this really hard time.
I will note that one of the interesting things that has struck me in doing this reporting is multiple folks from across the spectrum on their views on the Israel-Hamas war have really repeatedly talked about how emotionally difficult this has been, not only because of their reaction to the conflict itself, but also how difficult it is that they feel like rifts between their colleagues. These are members of Congress who were saying this to me, as well as activists in the interfaith space. And I bring that up because actually a chapter in my book kind of talks about how, particularly on Israel-Palestine, how interfaith communities have often been the communities that, particularly in liberal and progressive and democratic circles, that leaders have turned to those interfaith communities to help navigate those waters for them, that those relationships have been really important. It is unclear to me if or how those communities would be able to navigate the ongoing war and feelings on it. But I think the depth of the emotional angst that I'm seeing and hearing from folks on this war is such that it speaks to how long those relationships have been important to those communities, and raises the question of how they can or will be helpful to those coalitions in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, you're not as affected by people who you don't care for, or you don't care about. But when that rift happens, and many of us are experiencing it, it does really weigh on you, and it's unfortunately the inability to see a way forward right now. It's a few people. Everybody's, I think, trying, but there hasn't been a lot of and the ongoing suffering and that is very real. And so we're anyway, we're very much lifting up that in our hopes that the new year will bring some resolution. Speaking of the new year, anything that you're kind of turning the corner to and saying, okay, as I look around the corner, we mentioned the election, so I want to spend a little time on that and any thoughts you all have on how you see the election playing out, although there's been some good commentary on that. But any other stories that feel like they're on the horizon that you're intrigued by and that you're looking forward to exploring more?
I just want to add one thing about the election is that I am hearing that the concerns about mobilizing voters will be starting sooner than maybe it has in previous years. And every time you think that the mobilization efforts have done what they are going to do, like especially around Black churches and people of color who are concerned about things like what they see as voting limitations and that kind of thing across the country. Every time you think they've expanded as far as they could go, they do things that maybe show that, no, there's even more to do. So I think that that's one of the things I'll be watching is how the mobilization maybe kicks off in a big way sooner and leads to whatever the result will be in the fall.
Are there particular groups that you're interested in looking at, or is it DNC and GOP, or are there kind of para-denominational groups, or do you have any leads on who we should be watching?
There are groups that deal with it's a consortium of a bunch of groups that have worked in the past together. Might include the African American Clergy Network and Sojourners, and it's a long list of different groups of people that have worked together. And then there's also some of the consortiums that are statewide, like Faith in Florida, the one whose leader recently encouraged churches to start having their own Black history curriculums in light of the fact that in Florida, for instance, there were limitations. So those kinds of groups have always been big on the voter mobilization, but I'm understanding that they're going to be doing it at a greater rate than in the past.
Yeah.
Or at least hoping to.
Yeah. Jack, anything that you're, aside from a new member of the household, anything that you're anticipating going around the corner to the new 2024?
Yeah, the early primary season I'm out for, so I'll see you on the other side of that.
All right.
But I'll say that mentioning earlier the blowback from the Israel-Hamas war, and there does seem to be a disconnect. We have a couple polls that show like widespread support among Democrats for a ceasefire that is not represented in the White House or in Congress right now. Whether or not that'll matter will be an interesting question moving into 2024. On another issue again of abortion, I would expect Democrats to repeat the strategy that they have used in the last couple of cycles, which is kind of drilling down on that point, given that it does not seem to be a winning issue for Republicans at the ballot box for over and over and over again. Conversely, I should note, there has been some frustration given, as mentioned, Trump's more moderate take on abortion compared to his previous rhetoric now among kind of strident anti-abortion activists about what to do in this next election, and I'm curious whether there will be clashes between Trump and them. And now that assumes, of course, that there isn't a Nikki Haley ascendancy and that we end up with Nikki Haley as the nominee instead of Trump. Although, quite frankly, I would be surprised if Trump didn't run anyway, irrespective of whether he wins the Republican nomination. But if Trump is the nominee, I am also curious about how he leans into faith, right? And, previously it's been a big part of both of his presidential campaigns, his most recent ones. And deeply leaving in on that evangelical vote, in 2020 2020, he launched his Evangelicals for Trump initiative at a Spanish-speaking church in Florida, leaning in on Hispanic evangelical votes. I think is something I would expect him to repeat this go round. And curious about whether or not his rhetoric on abortion alters that for him. I'm also curious if his evangelical supporters, the cadre of the advisors that he surrounded himself, whether they all come back. There was a little back and forth about whether or not they wanted to back him earlier on. Most of them seem to be coming back into his fold over time. And just whether or not he campaigns in the same way as he did the last two go-rounds when it comes to his rhetoric around faith. Or if he just leans into other dialogue and talking points that we've been seeing him making on the campaign trail so far, that's less about faith and more kind of about his own Trumpism, if that makes any sense.
Well, when you, I think there's this, it's interesting. There have been several politicians, certainly, but using the rhetoric of the cult of Trump. And, and saying, I am their retribution, and, beginning to it's a very, there's interesting language that is being employed in order to rally people. Of course, I know there's going to be probably a 10-part series or probably more about the 30th anniversary of Interfaith Alliance, which is in 2024. So I've already set aside a lot of my calendars for the endless interviews from RNS. But anyway, it's okay. We'll talk about those in the future. For those of you listening, there's lots of smiles and laughter, uncomfortable smiles and laughter.
I'll get in touch with our video team for a Netflix series.
Yes, Netflix series. I think that's right. That's probably what it's going to be. Anyway, I just want to thank you both.
It is the anniversary.
It's the 30th anniversary, and it's actually, it's an interesting, kind of circle, and there will be more about this on the State of Belief, but. We were really founded as a response to the Christian Coalition and Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson and the kind of sense of an oversized influence of the Christian Coalition on American politics and in the, carrying the mantle of religion for America. And Interfaith Alliance actually was developed specifically in some ways in response to that and recognizing that there needed to be another voice on Capitol Hill, but also in affiliates around the country. And at one point, we had 185 affiliates around the country, and we're building those back up. So, it is an interesting history, and we'll be getting into more of that. And we will be doing a celebration, but I promise I will be appropriate in my pitching and not use this platform to hijack you in the future. How unprofessional of Paul Rauschenbusch.
First, congratulations on your pending anniversary. But for the record, RNS does not have a video team, nor
that was the joke.
Listen, I thought you were letting the cat out of the bag. Now, actually, I think RNS bought Netflix, didn't you? I mean, you're just the power of RNS.
I think the entirety of our video team is when I press record on my phone. I think that's.
I use video of my camera for an assignment over the weekend, so it does happen occasionally.
There you go.
Listen,
Jack and me as the team.
So Adelle is the one you pitch, Paul. That's the one.
That's how it starts. All right. Adelle M. Banks is project editor and national reporter at Religion News Service, an award-winning journalist. She was previously religion reporter at the Orlando Sentinel and a reporter at the Providence Journal and newspapers in upstate New York communities of Syracuse and Binghamton. Earlier this month, Adelle was honored for her outstanding media coverage at the Unsung She Rose Award, centering and celebrating Black women in ministry gala in Washington, D.C. Congratulations, Adelle. We celebrate with you and with all of America for your coverage. Award-winning journalist and national reporter for Religion News Service, Jack Jenkins, is the author of the book American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country, now in paperback, and has a brief appearance in Rob Reiner's upcoming documentary For God and Country. And, stay tuned on that because Interfaith Alliance is very focused on helping to get the word out about that important upcoming documentary. So thank you both for being with us again on the State of Belief. And who knows, I think things probably will calm down in 2024. Maybe we won't have any reason to have you back, but my guess is that we will. And thank you so much for keeping us informed in such a measured, intelligent, and an empathetic way.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
And that's all the time we have for this week's The State of Belief. Please be sure to subscribe to the new and improved podcast called The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. Subscribe to The State of Belief today. We need your help keeping The State of Belief going. I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And if you're getting something out of this show, share it with friends and family. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going when the show is over. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief, and share State of Belief with the people in your networks. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I'll be in conversation with preacher, stand-up comedian, and best-selling author Susan Sparks. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.